Hey there, welcome back. This is Andy with the Poor Proles Almanac. In this interesting episode, we talk with ecologist Cathy Mayne about her work in the Scottish Highlands, and we have some really interesting, uncomfortable conversations around what it looks like to rewild and what humans' role is in that, and how do we transition into a more sustainable ecology while dealing with the challenges of trying to feed people today while we build those systems up. Take a listen. Keep your mind open to this conversation, and we look forward to the feedback you'll give us. Without any further delay, here's our conversation. Cathy, first, can you tell me a little bit about your background in ecology?
Sure. So I live in the Highlands of Scotland near Fort William, and I've worked actively as an ecologist on and off for about 20 years of my life, but only really in this line for the last 10, 12 years. Before that, I was in the Cairngorms, which is a bit different, and I was working specifically with the ski area and the funicular project there. And I've also had a fairly substantial chunk of my life working in hospitality, in tourism, and as an outdoor instructor. So kind of got a few strands in there. What I do now, which is a product of all of the things, the experiences in my life coming together, is focusing around deer management, which is very politically topical and contentious at the moment, and hunting, which is also extremely contentious here in Scotland. Trying to take what's probably an ecologically middle of the road view, but also one that is perhaps a little bit deeper than some of the things that are happening here in conservation terms. So trying to increase the depth and therefore ecological soundness of any kind of policy agenda. Yeah.
Okay. As a hunter here, we kind of forget that there is hunting overseas because we think America, we're the ones with the guns, no one else has them. But that's not really the case. And I think that's at least very interesting at the very least. Could you talk really quickly about, I guess, the hunting culture over there?
Yeah, sure. You're right to say that we don't have guns in anything like the same way that you do. So normally, during my life, the only place I will see guns is at the airport. So we have armed police now all the time at the airports, international airports. But in my childhood, you never used to see guns at all. And then, of course, we had the Dunblane shooting, which was horrific, school children. And the firearms legislation here is really tight. So it's really difficult to get hold of a firearms certificate. And you have to have somewhere to hunt. So you can't just get a firearm and a firearm certificate if you can't demonstrate you've got somewhere to hunt. So the people who actually have firearms are relatively few, and they are focused on land management in some way, shape, or form. And I think the hunting culture really probably splits into two groups of people. So let's make it three. So there's the land managers who deliver the hunting, who are the stalkers or sometimes farmers or other people who hunt for part of or the whole of their job. It's part of their employment. And they may be delivering hunting with a client. They may be hunting in order to protect a crop, that sort of hunting. Then we have what we would call recreational hunters. And I suppose they're the two categories left. So the recreational hunters, there's quite a lot of people who do a bit, and they do it on their own. They've got access to, say, there's a piece of woodland that they're the nominated controller for, and they hunt there, and that's fine. That's kind of a little bit off the radar. And then there are people who they usually hunt with a stalker, and they're either a landowner or friends and family, or they're a paying client. So Americans, for example, hunting in the UK are usually in the paying client category, and they'll be going out with somebody whose job it is to take you out hunting. Yeah, that's roughly what we have. We don't have a lot of hunters.
Yeah, so when we're talking about this idea of hunting, obviously it's contingent on ecological conditions. You know, what the state of what your local forest, prairies, whatever it might be where you happen to be. I know despite it being a small collection of islands, it's actually pretty varied. So as an ecologist, could you talk a little bit about what that ecological condition is today? I know there are some problems with deer, so I'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
Yes, we have both a real and a perceived problem with deer. We've probably got a far higher density of deer in England than we have in Scotland, but it's not a political issue in England in the way that it is in Scotland. And it's become very politicized in Scotland based around the pattern of land ownership. So it's a product of a general disquiet around large areas of land residing in the hands of very few people. And it seems to me very clear that deer are being used as a lever in this discussion around land ownership. The main kind of challenge is that, or the main tension is between deer providing a source of revenue, whether that's in terms of clients or venison, and deer causing damage to crops, whether they're woodland forestry crops or they're agricultural crops. Or I suppose also the issue of road traffic accidents and public safety. So it does slightly depend on where you're coming from and who you are as to whether you perceive there are too many deer in Scotland. In my ecological role, I see a situation where our native woodland cover or our existing woodland cover is so low that this really essential part of deer ecology is in short supply. So the use of woodlands is quite concentrated, and the use of the open ground is quite dispersed. So the number of deer that can be supported by the open ground is actually much higher than the number of deer you would want in a woodland if you wanted regeneration to be successful in getting away. And that's where the other tension exists between whether you look to develop woodland for climate emergency reasons or for commercial reasons, behind fences or not.
And that's here in America, at least, and I'm sure it's the same over there. Deer tend to exist around those margins, so having those giant areas of prairie or grasslands between the forest just gives tons of that margin area, which I could see decimating getting into those forests.
Yeah, so we definitely, I see the biggest impacts on the edge of the forests where they're open. But there are also, I mean, red deer particularly are woodland species that here have learned to live in the open. So there are deer who live quite happily on the hills here that never get into trees. They are vulnerable in bad winter weather. So poor winters, they can be very vulnerable to really intense storms. But if the numbers are right, you know, they can survive at a particular population level reasonably comfortably, so long as there's some degree of topographic shelter.
So I don't know much about the history of the ecology there. I know obviously there's been a lot of clear cutting in the past, and then the realization that there had to be better land management has led to a lot of projects trying to reforest various chunks of the British Isles. Could you talk a little bit about that and kind of how that plays into this triangulated relationship between, I guess, urbanization, the relationships between deer in these spaces, and the people that have these weird dynamics over controlling that deer population, and kind of how you look at it from somebody that's both a hunter and an ecologist and concerned about the future of the planet? I know that's a light question.
Well, I'll do what I can to answer it and keep me back on track if I move off. The land here used to be much more productive than it is now, and that's due to climate. So climatic optimum 5,000-6,000 years ago, really quite good. Bronze Age for us. And we've had people in the British Isles since not long after it came out of the Ice Age. So since ice retreated, and what we would recognize more of a normal vegetation established itself. And conditions were prehistorically much more benign than they are now. So you see areas that were very definitely well inhabited, productive, weren't covered in woodland, 5,000-6,000 years ago. And then we hit a much wetter period. And that's when we had a lot of peat development, which is what we have a lot of in Scotland. And that's a product of this much wetter Atlantic period. And that's where you find trees that are buried in peat, which has become quite a, trees were here, you can see these trees. But actually those trees are often thousands of years old. They don't look it, you can actually see the bark. You can take the bark off and it's genuinely Scots pine. You can see it's Scots pine. But Scots pine,
That's wild.
yeah, Scots pine that died because of the development of the peat and couldn't grow there now because there's a meter or two of peat. Or the peat's perhaps been degraded, but underneath it, there is no kind of proper soil anymore. So it's partly a product of a change in climatic conditions to ones which are now much less optimal than they used to be. So the landscape is scattered with kind of evidence of human occupation and human activity that took place in an agrarian society, relatively lightly populated, but one which was in much better conditions. So it was much easier to grow arable crops, for example. And since then, we've had a significant series of events, if you like, one of which was the Industrial Revolution in all our towns and cities and the concentration of people into urban environments. Then the growth of the population, which also took place here in the 19th century in rural places. And very suddenly, people went from, having 12 kids and only 2 of them surviving infancy to one where, half of their offspring would survive. And very quickly, the land that was supporting that population became exhausted. That's when people emigrated. That's when people went to Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, and all the other colonial outposts, if you like. And a lot of the rural population of Scotland left at that time, a lot of them. And those that didn't leave, which were often the least able to leave, got cleared off and sheep put in their place. And in the process of trying to make that profitable at a time when Australia, primarily for wool production, Australia was also producing wool, starting to produce wool. And there was this competitive situation where large numbers of livestock, and then larger numbers of livestock were put on the hill to try to deliver profitability for landowners.
Was this during the 19th century?
Yeah.
So we had the
half.
same thing going on here with the sheep craze in New England.
Yeah. So very, very similar. And having inherited a landscape that was, I mean, for example, in the West, there were no deer, because if one deer appeared, it was hunted and put in the pot. So there were very few deer. But the transhumance nature of agriculture, where animals were kept close to the village, close to the houses, or in the houses during the winter, and then taken out onto the hill in the summer and grazed and milked and cheese made and so on out in the hill, and then brought back down again. You had this pattern of use, probably very similar to the Alps today, where you would have had favored areas quite heavily used, and then quite a lot in between that wasn't really used or wasn't used very much, but probably really quite good ground because it was very carefully managed and the animals were never left on their own. They were always being moved by people. So it was very, very carefully managed, to one where large numbers of livestock were put out onto the hill and now kept on the hill all year round. Very little in the way of human management latterly. No surprise that actually it got completely hammered. And what we have inherited now on the hill is an almost complete absence of woodland, because the livestock made sure that those woodlands died, and what didn't die was cut down in the First and Second World War. So we lost a lot of trees then because we had no, we were isolated. We had huge timber demand and nothing to provide it with. And very, very heavy grazing and burning over a long period of time. And for me, I think there's a real strong sense that quite a lot of the open ground, so unenclosed, unimproved ground, has probably passed thresholds where it can go back to what it was before. And the invasion of a number of unhelpful species, so in woodlands rhododendron, but on the hill purple moorgrass Millennia, which is a really unpalatable, unproductive grass that nothing really likes very much, and bracken, which is a woodland plant that's now covering, in high density ground that actually otherwise would be quite productive and probably would support woodland. So what we have is, on the open ground, a product of quite heavy, extensive livestock farming, and closer to home, we have quite, as you do too, quite intensive agriculture, which has lost its rotation. So it's either arable or it's pasture, but it's not both. And again, that's a challenge because you then lose soil depth, you lose soil inputs, you end up using a lot of fertilizers. We have massive fertilizer inputs, and then a lot of runoff problems and water quality problems that stem from that. And then you have to remember that in the UK, because of the population density, we have a huge amount of built infrastructure. And there's very little that isn't built.
I think that brings up kind of a fork in my questioning. So there's obviously this agricultural component and then this restorative component,
Yes.
Which may or may not be the same thing. It depends on how you'd want to look at it. Yeah. So your argument really is that we can't go back because the soil can't handle it, or the ecology can't support it as it exists today, yeah. And the climactic conditions have changed so much that what used to be here can't come back. So, yes. So what does it mean to try to I don't want to say restore because that's not really the right word, but to create positive ecological conditions that can be supportive of a future ecology?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think part of the problem around how we deliver that and how we deal with that is that conservation, by definition, looks backwards. We're trying to restore something to what it was before. Now, that may or may not be possible. But in a situation where things are changing all the time, is it a very sensible position? It's probably not, but it's what the legislation uses. So all of our legislation is based on the idea that you're restoring to something historic rather than moving forwards to something that will evolve. And because of the way that we are as a species, I think what we really struggle to do is which is going to be the ecologically sensible thing to do, is to restore the processes and sit back and let it get on with whatever it has to do and not mind what it looks like. We're very visual. We need to see in our mind what we're trying to achieve. And we have great difficulty in letting go and saying, do you know what? Crack on. I'm not going to interfere. Because when we've tried to do that, and there have been experiments where people have tried to reestablish some kind of natural set of processes, inevitably it goes through some phase which we're really uncomfortable with. And the experiment in the Netherlands, which tried to do that, the experiment that Frans Vera was involved with, intervention was inevitable because we couldn't tolerate the perceived suffering of animals that are starving.
Yeah.
And we therefore will always struggle with taking a very damaged ecosystem and letting it go through what is really quite a difficult set of changes to allow it to start to restore. It's very different if that ecosystem is close to natural or relatively close to natural, because that process isn't as uncomfortable for us.
I think so what we're talking about really is like accepting selection pressure as a tool to try to accelerate this process, where there's going to be those uncomfortable growing pains as species thin out and evolve with the ecological conditions. And unfortunately, for that progression, that evolutionary progression to happen, there's going to be things that don't work out. And in order for those species to evolve to these new conditions, there needs to be a massive die-off.
Yeah, I guess that's the inevitable position. But from an ecological point of view, it's the sensible thing to do. But I question whether we either have the capacity to do it, to tolerate it, nor do I actually think we've got the space, because I think we are too many. There are too many people on this planet already, and it's growing. So, here's the Earth. The population is already beyond capacity.
It's important to remember that we are borrowing energy from the future to sustain life today.
Yeah.
And I think that gets lost. Like, people will say you grow enough food for everyone alive. And it's like, well, yes, because we have these various inputs that otherwise wouldn't exist.
Yes. So trying to set aside land to rewild is very much a first world thing to do. It's very much a rich person's privilege, because the more we do here to take land out of production, to restore ecological functions and processes across space, the less we produce at home, and therefore the more somebody else has to produce for us to consume, because what we're not changing is our consumption, whether that's the consumption of stuff, goods, services, or experiences. And whilst you and I enjoy, and the listeners of this podcast enjoy, an exceptionally privileged lifestyle, everybody else on the planet has a right to expect the same. And we just don't have the capacity to deliver that. And until we accept the fact that we actually have to stop expecting more and accept the fact that we actually need to consume less, that question is not resolved. And in the absence of the resolution of that question, there becomes less and less space for anything other than humans on this planet.
With that in mind, I want to circle back to this idea of rewilding that you were just talking about. And pretty much everywhere in the world, humans have managed ecosystems, whether that's through controlled burning to create the ideal conditions for, like here in the at least here in the northeast of the United States, to allow for things like deer and these oak savanna ecologies. What is that role within like what we're talking about of, okay, we've got these degraded ecosystems, we want to let nature kind of figure out what should be the best species or habitat here, and we've got this weird mishmash of native and invasive species. Where do we fit into that? I know you're saying like we have a hard time taking our hands off, but that's kind of what we do, is put our hands on things. And what is that role?
Yeah, and I haven't in my own mind resolved that tension at all, but I do believe genuinely that nature doesn't need rewilding, people need rewilding. And any rewilding agenda that isn't completely integral in human life, that's happening over there, and we can go and visit it, but actually it doesn't impact on us other than the experience we can have by going and visiting it, actually it isn't deep, it isn't meaningful, it isn't going to change at the depth that we need to change. So when we use it as a conscience salve, we say, fine, I'm planting a few trees, I can go on flying around the world. Yeah, it's fine, it's cool. You know, I've offset my carbon. Really? And that we're, as a species, we're really good at doing that. We're really good at saying, hey, there's an easy option out there. I can go on doing the things I want to do because I can plant a few trees and that makes me feel great.
Yeah, carbon offsets.
Absolutely. And it allows us to ignore the difficult things, the things that we don't want to hear, because they might mean that we might have to do something that's a little bit uncomfortable for us. That's
one thing I've talked about quite a bit. Sorry, I just cut you off. With like, I'm sure you're familiar with permaculture. One of the challenges that I face fundamentally as someone that works in agriculture and deals with all these people that are like a permaculture food forest. And I'm like, well, if you don't learn to replace your staple crops, it doesn't matter how many exotic fruits and fruiting this and that. If you haven't figured out how to replace your daily toast with something else. And that's the part that, like, people that do permaculture and have these food forests, they still go to the store for staple crops, and those are the problem. Like, solving that 5-10% of, well, I'm not buying apples anymore, or whatever it might be, like, great, but that's a drop in the bucket of, like, you're not dealing with the real problem, which is these staple crops. How are we getting our meats and all these other things that are really the fundamental issues? And I think that's playing out in exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah. So I would like to see real appreciation of the need for people to be able to source their consumption locally. And that means pretty much everything they consume. I think that's the global economy, the globalization of the economy has been really unhelpful in this sense. And it's not just in our food, but it's in, everything else that we do, our leisure, our work, everything. It's about, making choices between something that's made in China, something that's made in the US, something that's made in Indonesia, and actually, no, we're not going to use the local stuff because it's expensive.
Yeah.
Slate, for example, roofing slates in this country is a case in point. They'll come from China. We produce slate in the UK, but nobody can afford it, or nobody chooses to afford it. So trying to localize the economy is clearly an important part of that. But if we made a big effort to create those positive natural experiences locally within a locality, people would feel less need to travel. If you could get a really nice natural experience on your doorstep, and you lived in a community where you could grow food, you could barter food, you could source most of the things that you needed within a relatively small community of, a few thousand people rather than millions of people, tens of thousands maybe, but not big stuff, then I think there's a degree of satisfaction there that people would recognize as contentment, which actually at the end of the day is all that we really should aspire to.
Yeah.
The idea of continuously being happy, again, is not something that's natural for humans.
Yeah, the metaphor I use a lot for what you're talking about is the craft beer effect, where the thing about craft beer that makes it appealing to such a wide group of people is it's unabashedly local, and it's so important as a craft brewery that's local to integrate things that are about your community into that beer, and that's what draws people in. And if a bakery opens up, what is it doing that makes it local? And I think that's what sometimes gets lost. It's like, oh, we need to compete with artisan bakeries that are regional or whatever, but it's not unabashedly local. And that's where I think people are drawn to it because of that, and they're willing to pay a premium because of that. And it's not because they want to support local businesses, it's because this is part of how I identify with myself, and the triangulated relationship between your culture and your food and your sense of place.
Yes.
That I think gets way more often than it should be forgotten, that the reason why our cultures are what they are is because of our food, which is the way it is because of the place we live.
Yes.
And that's an important piece of it.
That's absolutely critical. I mean, there's a couple of examples I can think of here which are really valuable. So we have a lovely little enterprise called Scotland the Bread, which is about trying to replace, the dreaded white sliced loaf full of nothing. A lot of our food is nutritionally empty or nearly nutritionally empty, with proper bread that's been grown in Scotland. The wheat's been grown in Scotland. We're using Scottish grown rye, sourdough from, just trying to do stuff with local stuff. We have a wonderful little brewery just up the road from me. I mean, I can walk there on a Saturday and buy a case of beer. I don't drink any other beer. They produce fabulous beer, Glen's Beer and Brewery. Shout out for you guys. But it's fantastic. And it's only been going for a few years. But it's those sorts of things also give you a strong sense of pride in place. And how do we recreate those communities and bring nature into our communities so that we're rewilding our communities, our living spaces, not just creating rewilding somewhere else we can go and visit?
Absolutely.
And that's actually I think that's actually the only way we are going to cope with the tension between resource availability and population.
Yeah, and this kind of brings me back to well, not brings me back, but I think ties all of this together into, I think, to me, is thinking about this now for like a decade has kind of brought me to this point of thinking about what our future, and like I said, what humanity's role is in all of this. And one of the things that I think I get a lot of pushback when I say it is that when we think about work and these conditions and what we're talking about, that there's all these fundamental flaws in the way we live today. And when we talk about work, I think people glorify the past. And I don't mean like the industrial past, but pre-industrial past. And think that, if we go back, that there's more time for leisure and people can be more passionate about the things they want to be focused on. And I'm of the belief that chances are we're due for generations, if we were to move in the right direction, of people working long amounts of hours doing things like land management, trying to accelerate some of those processes and ecologies that can be salvaged, and to really think about, like you were saying, what a standard of living really looks like.
Yes.
That it just, there's a lot of talk, especially on the left, about like, well, if we took the 10 richest people and redistributed that wealth or whatever. And it's like, again, you're missing the point that all that wealth is bought from borrowed time.
Yes.
And we, whether it's my generation, my children's generation, or the generation after, someone is going to have to pay for that eventually.
Yeah.
And my job, at least the way I look at it, is to try to ease that as much as I can for future generations. And that might mean more work, and that I think gets uncomfortable for people.
Yeah, but you say work and you're using a term which actually, when you talk about the kind of work that you're talking about, isn't really work. It's different from money earning work. So
Sure.
I do work for clients and I earn money doing it. And I realistically do as little as I can get away with, because I don't want to spend all my time doing that kind of thing, because
Sure.
the other work that I do is I grow my food. So
Yeah.
I increasingly grow in my little suburban type garden. Probably now, obviously not some of the staples like flour, but pretty much 70-80% of the fruit and vegetables I eat. I've got a freezer full at the moment, which is fantastic because I can see through the wind. Might not be very interesting, but it's extremely healthy. It's extremely tasty. I've got a curry in the slow cooker at the moment, which is venison that I've shot, tomatoes that have come out the polytunnel yesterday, and onions that I grew, and swede that I grew. So, it's all not completely, but mostly homegrown.
Just one thing I want to clarify, because you and I may find that type of work or labor enjoyable, but I know probably not this audience particularly, but there are a lot of people that the idea of going outside is like painful to them, where they have no interest in it. They're so used to an air conditioned, dehumidified room. If you were to say, hey, let's go do this, they would look at it as work. And I think that would change with the exposure to it.
Yes.
But that, to a lot of people, again, that's not their dream of like, oh, I'm going to spend my days like, watching sheep to make sure that they graze the appropriate amount, and trimming up these trees and this and that, whatever it might be.
Yeah, and those are the people who desperately need to be rewilded.
Absolutely.
That's the job that we have to do, is to give them those experiences so that they recognize the fact that actually it's not work. It's incredibly fulfilling. I used to be, desperate to travel and lots of experiences and blah, blah, blah. And actually I spend a lot less time wanting to do that and a lot more time being very satisfied with a smaller life. That's much, much more rewarding. And then that kind of takes us full circle back to the hunting, because it's one of those immersive experiences which has to be immersive if it's going to be successful. but it also speaks to a very, very primitive part of our biology, which producing food also speaks to, and which allows us to get a real, for me, certainly a kind of, whoa, eureka moment, thinking, oh my word, I had no idea it could be this exciting, this completely, I can't think about anything else. I'm completely there in the moment. I'm incredibly grateful for it. I'm incredibly inspired by it. We need to try to give experiences like that speak to our basic biology, to those people who have no nature, no wildness in their lives, because it's only when they understand the value of that they realize how badly off track they've gone, and how doesn't matter how much you've got of wilderness over there, the fact that you live in a completely sterile environment with no connection with nature, that's what's making you miserable, not the fact that you could be earning $20,000 a year more if you got a promotion, because somehow that would solve all your problems.
And I think that ties together everything we've talked about. Let me ask, for folks that are really interested in what we've talked about, is there anywhere they can follow you? I know social media. Are you involved with any organizations or anything that you would be like, hey, if this is all interesting stuff, go check out XYZ, anything like that?
So I'm a bit of a... I avoid social media. I am on Instagram as Cathy Mayne 65, and I do post not very much, but occasionally. And I don't have an active blog, so I'm not very good at being anything for people to follow. But I do think that there are some really valuable resources out there that even if they're not so much about nature, for me, I probably came to this as much through mindfulness as I did through anything else. So I think the fun thing for people is that this can be a journey of exploration, and there's nothing to replace just getting out there, getting your hands dirty, getting wet, getting cold feet. Yeah, exactly.
Get dirty.
Exactly. Yeah. That is the most joyful thing there is. I just go out and do it.
Cathy, thank you so much. This was great.
My pleasure. You take care.
Hopefully you found it insightful, and hopefully you understand it within the context of a larger conversation about what the future looks like and our role in transitioning it. If you enjoyed this conversation, please give us a review on iTunes or go visit us on Patreon or Venmo to support this project. As always, this is Andy, and this is the Poor Proles Almanac.